Welcome to the second day of our first annual Asian Literatures in Motion conference dedicated to the works of Michael Ondaatje. And the first day, of course, was yesterday when we had one of our keynote addresses by Professor Harshana Rambok-Weller, who placed the whole oeuvre of Ondaatje between the two poles of, on the one hand, cosmopolitanism and nationalism. And then he sort of talked about the fact that how nations can be fictitious constructions. So he kind of set the pace, and then we went on into two plenaries with Debashri Datta Ray and Jean Ewert from Florida, which was followed by a very animated and a very productive discussion by Roma and Julie, which set the tone for things to follow, and three papers then by graduate students, Harsh, Raka, and Assistant Professor Kumko. So that brings us to today, and let's begin today by just telling those who've joined us for the first time that this project, this conference, was the idea of doing the conference on Ondaatje was Julie's idea, because she taught the course, the single author course on Ondaatje at the U of T, University of Toronto Scarborough campus, and had been very familiar with his works and had wanted to do something, and so that's how it starts. And then she coins the term, she plucks out the idea of globe of fear, which sounded astounding and terrifying and wonderful at the same time. And then we got to work, and Julie began arranging, to get the best scholars in the field. And then we also have to thank Cynthia for her efforts to bring in some excellent scholars to participate in the two-day conference. So with that, I welcome Cynthia van den Dryzen, who's been an old friend of Julie and mine. She's been the founder president of the ASAA, the Association for the Study of Australasia and Asia, quite a mouthful. And we attended a couple of conferences with her under her tutelage in Hyderabad, where we've also met some excellent scholars like Bill Ashcroft and some other very cutting-edge people. And then we went on to produce a couple of books, conference proceedings. So it was all a wonderful experience with Cynthia. So Cynthia completed her undergraduate studies at the University of Ceylon and doctoral studies at the University of Western Australia. She has taught at universities in Asia, Africa, and Australia. Her research interests lie in the fields of Australian, Indian, West African post-colonial literatures. Her publications include 10 books. The most recent being the sole authored book is Writing the Nation, Patrick White and the Indigene in 2009, and her last co-edited work is Patrick White's Centenary, The Legacy of a Prodigal Son in 2014. She's currently a visiting honorary research fellow at the University of Western Australia. And with those brief comments, I very warmly welcome Cynthia to come and give a few remarks for a few minutes.
Thank you so much. It's been a lovely experience. Even yesterday, though I was mostly absent and present from time to time, just to listen in on all the wonderful conversations. I am no expert on Michael Ondaatje. It's simply that I should mention that we share perhaps two common life experiences, the experience of being born in Sri Lanka, and also then the experience of migrating from that country to become a citizen of another, as I live in Australia. But we both also share a kind of nostalgia for that absolutely paradisal country. If you haven't visited it, you must try to visit it sometime. one conference we organized in Sri Lanka, we took along a didgeridoo player, an Australian Aboriginal artist. And he went to one place in Sri Lanka and he said, "Is this paradise?" Quite genuinely. Julie, Meera Chand was with us, and she still remembers that experience, this guy making that comment. She felt very much the same.
Yes.
It's going through a horrible phase of life at the moment. Please God, that will pass. As everything horrible and awful in this world must pass. Anyway, I do want to say I was extremely happy through the people I have met through the years at the ASA events to be able to introduce Harshana Rambukwela to Julie and Harish, an e-introduction, which they made good use of. The most gratifying thing is being able to introduce Harshana, and you all got to hear him yesterday, and he's such a genuine educationist and, a lover of, literature. And he's written himself, he writes wonderfully, the appreciation he did of Jean Arasanagam was quite wonderful. That's why I rang him and got to know him then, because that's how he came into literature, through Jean Arasanagam. Now, so Isabel Alonso is the other person I was able to introduce to Julie and Harshana. And Isabel is simply a lovely human being. I met her when she was only a student, postgraduate student, and now she's on the staff at the University of Barcelona. And she went to Sri Lanka once, but fell in love with the country and mostly with the literature. And she has continued researching in Sri Lankan writers in English. Now, there's one more point I want to make about Ondaatje, but I'm reserving it for the end. And I think I'm already gone beyond my 5 minutes. But what I really want to say, it's the most important thing I want to say, is that I think Julie and Harish need to be congratulated on this wonderful way they have made use of. Perhaps it was because of the pandemic that they set it up, but it is such a joy at this awful, arid, really quite agonizing, traumatizing time of the world to be able to have access like this, to speak to each other across, countries and zones, and, to share so much that can give us joy. In spite of the horrors, there is so much goodness. And much of that goodness comes from the arts, from literature. And I'm mad at Australian politicians who have made a humanities degree extremely expensive. Everything else is subsidized and encouraged, but the humanities is really being subsidized. I must mention it. The University of Western Australia, which is a beautiful university with wonderful traditions, has actually closed down two disciplines, sociology and anthropology. What a criminal thing to do. And again, we share experts from all over the world. Our current Vice Chancellor is actually, I won't name him, but he's an Indian-Canadian who has come to Western Australia from Toronto, I think, or some Canadian university. No, thank you for that. I had to say it. Okay, that's all from me. And I would say, if you have got a glass by you, I think we should raise a toast, just a glass, a toast to Julie and Harish for this wonderful strategy of making so much joy available to us. And I hope you continue with this project and may it go from strength to strength, your journals, your book club talks, and your conferences for many years to come. God bless you. Okay.
Thank you, Cynthia. Harish and I are always overwhelmed by what you have to say, but you know, we don't have to repeat it. You don't want me to say too much about it, but what you've done for us by always keeping us in your academic meditations and inviting us to so many conferences, we are ever grateful. Long live Cynthia Vanden Ryson. Thank you so much.
I've lived my life. Thank you, darling.
So welcome again, everyone. We've got a bit of a Toronto mafia on here today, and that includes not just Professor Marlene Goldman and Professor Aparna Halpe, but also my dear friend here, Smitha Kotari, Dr. Smitha Kotari, Professor in Religious Studies, who is now, I think, woken up early in the morning, but we are happy to see you here, Smitha. Another U of T member of the mafia. Okay, so before I turn to my friend and comrade in arms, Dr. Aparna Halpe, I want to very, very quickly, within a minute, revisit Professor Harshana Rambukwela's salient points from his keynote yesterday. So he speaks about literary cosmopolitanism and undergirds the entire keynote with the thought that we must think and feel beyond the nation. And of course, we know, most of us who've delved into nationalism and ultranationalism and Benedict Anderson, that it was Bruce Robbins who brought this idea to the fore. And Professor Rambukwela mentions that the sense of international recognition that Michael Ondaatje has received is very important to us in the history of post-colonial nationalism. Being trapped in a particularly dodgy place, I think it allows us this powerfully important moment where Ondaatje, with the Creation Prize, which he initiated in Sri Lanka under the tutelage of and administering by Professor Rambukwela, is a prize that provides a kind of literary legitimacy, if I might say, that has empowered many young writers and even older ones to perpetuate the literary legacy and prestige that the brand name Michael Ondaatje brings to the fore. And I remember the ontological reality is that Shehan Gunathilaka, 2010, who wrote, I think, Aparna, if I'm not mistaken, Chinaman, the Legend of Pradeep Matthew, I think, right?
That's correct, yes.
And won the DSC Prize and the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. He also helped Carl Muller, Jean Arasanangam. And the last point I want to remember from his keynote is that his quote that Michael Ondaatje said, "Nothing is as exciting for us as to find our place, our own stories in a book. When that happens, the self is doubled. We are no longer insignificant." I think the idea of the father connecting to the fatherland, the importance of feeling a sense of belonging, and although diasporic belonging still to Sri Lanka, is something that Aparna will highlight, as I think Professor Marlene Goldman will. And might I add that Aparna and I are bonded in a remarkable familial connect of having the same mentor and doctoral supervisor, the prodigious scholar of South Asian literature, most accomplished, compassionate, and erudite professor who headed the South Asian Studies at U of T, University of Toronto. Aparna's father, Ashley Halpe, who was Professor Chelva Kanaganayakam, our mentor's professor at the University of Colombo, is a legendary scholar, someone, I think the story goes, who was instrumental in beginning to put Michael Ondaatje's texts into the curriculum. Am I right, Aparna?
That's right. He was the first person to do so.
Right. So Aparna's a very privileged woman, but she's also a woman who's made use of that privilege for other people. She's a professor of English at Centennial College in Toronto. Her research is on the function of myth and contemporary post-colonial fiction. Her scholarly work has appeared in Interferences Literaries 2015, the University of Toronto Quarterly 2016, and a whole lot of journals, including the UNESCO Observatory eJournal. What is most exciting for us today, though, is that she is co-editor with Michael Ondaatje of the forthcoming Laktas Vikramasinghe's A Selection of Poems. She is also the author of a collection of poems, Precarious, and her creative writing has appeared in a whole lot of texts, and she is known for her virtuosity on the violin. So all of us who were speaking with such excitement about jazz and the ellipses and the lapses which we need to read into Ondaatje's works is directly referential to what Aparna does on a daily basis. Take it away, Aparna.
Oh my goodness, I'm kind of speechless after that. Thank you so much, Julie, and thank you so much, Harish. I'm so honored to be here, and with so many scholars whom I deeply, deeply respect, and with old friends. And also, I just have to have a shout out to Smitha. I saw you there earlier. Great to see you again after such a long time. And Isabel, whom I have never actually met and never seen, but we have collaborated before, and it's just a joy to share this space with you. I'm in Toronto, and I'm on the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. And this place that we are in is covered by the Treaty 13 that is called the Dish with One Spoon. And the understanding of Treaty 13 was that if we approached our environment from a position of respect and mutual sharing and understanding, we would be having a very different relationship to the world that we inhabit. And the Mississaugas did not just have, this is not just a settler colonist kind of approach to understanding what acknowledging the land is. If you think about it, these were treaties that they had with the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Ojibwe, but also, very importantly, the concept of the treaty is larger than just human beings. It acknowledges the nations of the plant worlds, the nations of the animal worlds of this place. And they existed before us, and one hopes that they will exist beyond us, but that is often in doubt these days, isn't it? But in acknowledging the land, I also have to acknowledge the land that I came from, and that is Sri Lanka. And to acknowledge that I myself am a colonist in that place. Because if we acknowledge that the first inhabitants of Sri Lanka were neither Sinhala nor Tamil, but they were the indigenous peoples, the Vadas, and those nations and languages we destroyed so that we could squabble over territory and drench that land in blood before any white man ever set foot on that place. And I want to start there, and I want to begin by placing myself in that kind of position. So this is going to be very personal. I apologize. There's a lot of anecdote, but the reason for that is because I'm trying to attempt to portray a particular moment, which I think was actually quite important in Michael's life, and so I'm going to start there. I first met Michael in 1980. And of course, he has no recollection of me, but I have a very, very strong recollection of him. In 1980, I was 7 years old. And this young man showed up on our doorstep. He was there to meet my father, Professor Ashley Halpe, that Julie has spoken about. And all I remember was this mane of black hair and the voice. You don't forget Michael Ondaatje's voice. It's quite, even then it was powerful. And then a little bit later in the day, we would go to the American Center, where he would give a reading from his book, Rat Jelly, which had just come out. And this poem it was branded in my brain. And I was much younger than my siblings, by many years. And I took to running around the house in what we call jungies, which is what you put in the kids because it's so hot, you run around in your jungies. And I would be screaming at the top of my voice, steaming, dirty rat jelly. And that was my 7-year-old take on Ondaatje's poem. So this was just, he was definitely the first poet who had that sort of striking effect on me, and of course shaped my journey as a poet as well. So that's my story, and I think, as Ondaatje himself would say in Running in the Family, a well-told story is worth 1,000 facts. But to get to some facts, why was Michael visiting us in Colombo? In 1980, Sri Lanka was in a period sort of best described as an uneasy lull. The genocide of Black July in 1983 was yet to come. Tensions were high in the north and east, but for most middle-class Sinhala folk, the horrific events of the 1971 radical left insurrection of the JVP was what was foremost in living memory. The reason that Michael was visiting my father in Mount Lavinia, which is a suburb of Colombo, was because the Faculty of Arts was considered a hotbed for radical young intellectuals and JVP sympathizers, and they had been forced by the government to relocate to Kalinia, a suburb of Colombo, in the university reorganization of 1973. My father, all the lecturers of the English department, and all the students were effectively in exile in their own country. Ondaatje's visit to Sri Lanka happens in the wake of this moment in 1980. In 1980, where they had been already settled in this place for some time, but very much in that state of sort of chaos and dislocation. And in Colombo, he would encounter several key poets, intellectuals, and scholars that, through this random violence of history, had gathered in that particular place. During this visit, Ondaatje would establish several key relationships that would evolve over time, and more importantly, would lay the foundation for his continuing relationship with the country, and in particular, his interest in fostering a climate of literary production in the country. And of the many artists and intellectuals that Ondaatje met, I just want to highlight a few because I will be returning to them many times in the course of this paper. Most important was Ian Gunathilaka, H.A.I. Gunathilaka, famous bibliographer, and most importantly, a champion of local writers. And he had a fierce dedication for fostering literature and translation. And that was perhaps one of the most important influences on Ondaatje at this time and in the years to come. There was my father, Ashley Halpe, who was a scholar in exile, as I mentioned. He was a poet in his own right, and most importantly, a dedicated pedagogue who would be the first person to put Ondaatje on a syllabus. There is Tissa Jayathilaka, who at that time was an emerging scholar. He was part of the students who were relocated. And this group of students from Peradeniya would include several other literary luminaries, such as the person we just spoke of with such love, Shelva Kanaganayagam, and Chandani Lokuge. And Jayathilaka would eventually become the chairman of the board of directors of the Gratian Trust, working together with Michael and with Ian Gunathilaka for many, many years. And I think quite significantly, this was when Michael really had that interaction with the work of the poet Lakdasa Wickramasinghe. It was posthumous. Lakdasa had died by drowning, coincidentally. Also, he would come up with this, he was an alcoholic, but he would say he was going to come visit my parents in Mount Lavinia. He would go off and have a drink and go swimming. And those the waters of the Indian Ocean are treacherous, and we all know what happened next. It was very sad. But this relationship with Lakdasa Wickramasinghe's work, which was also in many ways a relationship with Ian Gunathilaka, was going to become very significant in the years to come. These individuals, with the exception of Wickramasinghe, shared a peculiar collective experience of disenfranchisement following the dissolution and forced transfer of the Department of English from the University of Peradeniya following the insurgency of the 70s and the government crackdown on intellectuals and students. They were dislocated, uprooted from the idyllic hill country institution that was Peradeniya. And to echo Cynthia, if you haven't been, you should go. And I will put it out there. I think Peradeniya is the most beautiful university in the world. I have not seen anything like it. They had been forced to relocate from there to Vidyalankara, which would eventually now become the August University of Kalaneer. But at that time, it was still under construction. And lecturers and students were forced to work in what we call takarang sheds. These are metal sheds, and they were baking in the heat, sharing the space with dogs and cows and cow dung and all of that stuff. And at the same time, fearing for their lives while desperately trying to forge artistic and academic careers in a country that was coming apart at the seams. It should be noted that Lakdasa had already been at Kalaneer, and he tried to eke out a living as an instructor in English while he self-published his poetry. I think this too would be important, because I think, Wickramasinghe is another one of those examples of a poet who would rise to fame posthumously because of an institutional climate and culture that refused to support its own. We might read Running in the Family as the mythic memoir filled with colorful descriptions of wild boars taking baths with soap and Lala's magic ride in Nuarelia, or Mervin's sort of dipsomaniac upheavals on the Ceylon Railroad. But I think for Lankan readers of the 80s, the epigraph of the section Don't Talk to Me About Matisse by Lakdasa Wickramasinghe provides a subtext that is present throughout the work, and that is of the voices of a generation of artists, intellectuals, and scholars who were speaking out despite the tightening noose of government repression. To be sure, Ondaatje himself would never put on the mantle of a radical poet, and that was a position for which he was chastised frequently by generations of Lankan critics, both local and diasporic, who desired an author of his stature to represent the nation and its conflicts with greater historical accuracy. Take, for example, the critiques by the late Qadri Ismail. I'm actually quite devastated at his passing. Another person with whom I had a personal relationship going back to when he was a student at Peradeniya. Qadri would, in his critiques, would in turn shape critical responses in Canada, such as Arun Mukherjee's The Sri Lankan Poets in Canada, An Alternative View. And this kind of ripple of the referential anxiety that we have as critics is something that's quite important, I think, right? And of course, such critics would be sorely disappointed and find their sort of critical rage further fueled when Ondaatje would publish his slippery novel, Anil's Ghost. And so I find it really interesting then, in contradistinction to these, I don't know if I can say this, but I'm going to say it, post-colonially reactionary ways of reading Ondaatje, Critics such as the late Shelba Kanaganayakam or Chandani Lokuge offer a more nuanced engagement with Ondaatje's poetics and politics. Lokuge's rich and complex analysis of desire as a form of return in Ondaatje's poetry, the return journey and the aesthetic of rasa in Michael Ondaatje's poetry, is born out of an engagement with the Sanskrit notion of rasa and an understanding of the often vexed issues of nostalgia, representation that preoccupy the diasporic writer. Kanaganayakam's many critical analyses of Ondaatje's work are significant and unfortunately a slim corpus because, of course, as we know, it was sadly cut short by his untimely passing. Kanaganayakam's grasp of the relationship between race, class, migration suggests that despite all accusations of privilege, the experience of displacement, as it is narrated in Running in the Family, is real enough for Ondaatje. And I quote from him, "The need to return finds expression through dreams that encroach into Ondaatje's consciousness, and through the marginal positions of sleeping on a couch at a friend's home." Kanaganayakam suggests that the absence of an emotionally weighted position in relation to the trauma of recent Sri Lankan history precludes Ondaatje's capacity to belong to the island nation as the returned prodigal. But he points out that Ondaatje shares the shortcomings of the majority of Sri Lankan writers in English who produced uneasy, refracted portraits of a country in turmoil. This perceptive analysis of Ondaatje's position paradoxically places him within a particular circle of belonging, a belonging to the silence that accompanies the witnessing of trauma, even if not in lived experience, right? It is the knowledge that speaking, articulating, representing that trauma might in itself be an act of violence and appropriation. And I think Ondaatje has always been aware of that, frankly. I've often wondered at the distinctly different readings of Ondaatje that were offered by Lokuge and Kanaganayakam. I wonder why, while writing within the critical frames of post-colonial theory and discourse, and within the greater intellectual community of the Lankan diasporic critics around the world, they resisted the urge to read Ondaatje through the critical frames that were so prevalent at the time, and in many ways so referential within the context of diasporic Lankan literary criticism. And so, I'd like to return to those exiled intellectuals and scholars at Peradeniya in the 70s. Both Lokuge and Kanaganayakam were contemporaries. They were young graduate students in a department that was, at that time, censored, displaced, nearly destroyed. Together with other young scholars like Tissa Jayathilaka, they experienced the horrors of the insurgency, the unofficially detained and disappeared fellow students. In fact, they were the students in the graffiti-covered walls at Vidyalankara that Ondaatje would write about in Running in the Family. Kanaganayakam, as a young Tamil intellectual, would witness the unspeakable trauma of the genocide that would take place in 1983 and the way it affected his family. And yet, through it all, these particular young scholars chose to follow a path in the world of Commonwealth literature that would become post-colonial literature, and they chose to write back, but differently. Their profoundly nuanced readings of text and context and their particular capacity to draw connections between the multiplicities of aesthetic inheritances that find voice in diasporic writers such as Ondaatje is quite unique. And I would suggest characteristic of a school of criticism. I'm just putting this out there. We speak of a Frankfurt school, and someday I wonder whether in the context of Lankan literary criticism, we might speak of the exiled Peradeniya school, albeit in a very different tenor and tone. I brought this brief glimpse at Ondaatje's diasporic Lankan critics to a particular place that I admit is highly subjective, but it is in the main part of the portrait of a particular moment, an intersection, an intervention, if you like. That was part of the artistic, intellectual, and political climate that Ondaatje encountered when he visited Sri Lanka in 1980. I offered that this encounter would significantly shape the course of his relationship to Sri Lanka and indeed his Lankan works of fiction and poetry. It would also lay the foundation for his commitment to foster literary production within the country, the most cogent example of which was his forming of the Gratian Trust and the country's first independent prize for literature, the Gratian Award, which was in 1992. While the Gratian has made several careers of emerging writers in English, more significant, I think, than the Gratian itself was the founding of the H.A.I. Gunathilaka Prize, named for Ian Gunathilaka, which is awarded for outstanding work in translation. Speaking on the importance of translation, Ondaatje said in an interview with me, I think it is, that is, translation is, a natural thing for a place like Sri Lanka to have. It's essential to have that kind of dialogue going on between the three languages. The unawareness of Sinhala writing and Tamil literature by English-speaking people and vice versa is very sad. So in that sense, it's really important. I think in some ways, it's the most important thing that the Gratian Trust could do. And that was in 2012. The Ian Gunathilaka Prize for Translation has given us gems, such as Shelva Kanaganayakan's own translation of Sadangu, which is Esponathure's The Ritual, Carmen Wickramagamaga's translation of Sunetra Rajakaranayaka's Metta, I would think one of the great feminist novels to come out of this program, I would say. And more recently, Malinda Seniviratna's translation of Simon Navagatnagama, filmmaker and novelist, The Hunter in the Wilderness of Samsara. And just as a side note, Malinda Seniviratna just won the Ian Gunathilaka Prize for this round as well. He's one of the best translators out there. More importantly, it offers authors the opportunity to publish with Three Wheeler Press, the publishing house dedicated to the Trust, which Ondaatje views as one of the most important contributions of the Trust. I want to conclude by briefly speaking of those ripples which spread from Ondaatje's visit to Sri Lanka in 1980. Ondaatje describes Ian Gunathilaka as a vivacious, opinionated time capsule. And I can't think of a better description of Ian. It's perfect. That's exactly what he was. Pointing out that Ian was the first person with whom he could have an actual conversation about the poetry of Lakdasa Wickramasinghe. As Ondaatje also notes, Gunathilaka's commitment to protecting what he could of the artistic production of a poet like Wickramasinghe or a painter like George Keat was not just about literature and art, it was about the problems that existed in Sri Lankan politics at the time. When Ian Gunathilaka first approached me to co-edit the collected works of Lakdasa, that was in 1998, I declined, as I was just leaving Sri Lanka and I was about to embark on a doctorate in Canada, and perhaps I already sensed that I would not return to Sri Lanka. I suspect Ian also knew this, and this was his way of sort of willing me to return and to undo the brain drain through which I was just going to become one more statistic. But to be honest, I was just afraid of the responsibility and just too intimidated by Ian himself to take on the job of editing the work of Lakdasa Wickramasinghe with him. So eventually Ian began the project himself with my father as co-editor. But at the passing of both Ian and then eventually my father, and with the PhD behind me, I did return to the project. I took it up and invited Michael to be my co-editor, which he very graciously agreed to do. What Michael brought to this project was a commitment to very carefully curate Lakdasa's work, presenting a fine and representative selection of his poetry in English. But what we both instantly agreed on and doggedly persevered in was the decision to publish Lakdasa's largely unknown Sinhala poems in translation, thus making these poems available both to an audience in Sri Lanka and around the world for the first time since their original publication. And I just wanted to remind you at that point that Lakdasa self-published. All of his volumes of poetry are extremely rare as a result. So this project ends with a trilingual collection that will be translated into English and to Sinhala and Tamil. And I was going to follow up and wrap all of this up by saying what I hope is that I gave a sense of the portrait of 1980 and how that influenced this relationship with literary production. And I want to end with Michael's words himself, where he says, the journey or process where an artist follows the brush is the same path a writer or architect takes when loitering. It is light years away from just a political or public or thematic reason for existence. Thank you.
Dazzling, absolutely dazzling, and so much to digest, so much to revisit. Aparna, I think this conversation can go on and will go on for a long time. You mentioned slippery novel, Anil's Ghost. I think that is going to open up a Pandora's box, inevitably, in the next few presentations. But I will leave one question with you in your mind, and maybe we can come back to it. We never speak of Rienzi Cruz, nor do we speak of the other diasporic Sri Lankan-Canadian writer, Shyam Selvadurai, in the same breath as Ondaatje. And I think that itself speaks quietly, but speaks volumes. And, you know, Chelva and us have had many conversations about this, but it is really the fact, I think, that Michael Ondaatje does not wear activism on his sleeve. And that becomes problematic for his literary colleagues. More about that later, more to learn from you. But right now, it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Dr. Isabel Alonso Breto. She's lecturer in post-colonial studies at the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures and English Studies at the University of Barcelona. Her paper title is intriguing, Reading Care in Anil's Ghost. So she will be speaking to us about the ethics of care. And she was very kindly introduced to us by Dr. Cynthia Van den Rijssen. Really grateful for that. She's carried out research on several post-colonial territories, exploring works by authors in the Australian, Canadian, Caribbean, South Asian, South African origins, and in recent years is paying special attention to Sri Lankan and Tamil literature in English. With a very warm welcome, I hand you over to Dr. Isabel Alonso Breto.
I want to really thank you dearly, both Harish and Julie, if I may, both, also Cynthia, of course, for putting me through with you. I'm just honored. Also, as Aparna said, well, to me, this is an enormous honor to be sharing this panel, this conference. So I'm really excited about this. And here I go with my paper. I would say from an outsider perspective, as I hope it should be. Anyway, let me tell you about the ethics of care very quickly. As it is known in the West, because there are, of course, concomitancies with other cultures and ethic traditions, the ethics of care has its origin in the research that psychologist Carol Gilligan put forward in her groundbreaking study In a Different Voice, Psychological Theory and Women's Development, published in 1982, which revealed that women tend to have an ethical perspective characterized by interpersonal relations and not by abstract rules or principles. as Kantian ethics would have it. Gilligan's findings were nearly simultaneous with those of Sarah Rudick, who 2 years earlier had published the article Maternal Thinking. According to Rudick, the mother's care for the fragile newborn would be paradigmatic of the caring attitude necessary for human beings to survive, given our vulnerability not only in our early infancy, but also in other key periods, such as old age or infirmity, and virtually throughout all our life. This ethics is based on an understanding of the world as a network of relations where we are immersed and where the acknowledgement of our responsibility towards the other emerges. For the ethics of care, and I'm quoting here, the compromise towards the others is understood as an action taking the shape of help. The subject has the obligation to help the others. If we see a necessity, we feel obliged to contribute to solving it. In this way, this ethics is a sort of relational guide, directed by the consciousness of the need to pay attention to others and their needs. It is preoccupied against universal laws of virtues by context and particularity, by the diversity of locations and the situatedness of any relationship or situation where it intervenes. Thus, the moral development of the subject turns around specific, not abstract, again, responsibilities and relations. Theoreticians defend the necessary application of the principles of care and relationality to humankind, suggesting that they replace the patriarchal, hierarchical, power-based, and often militarized systems which have so far governed modern societies. In the last 3 decades, care ethics has grown from a personal perspective, a personal ethical perspective, to a full-bodied moral and political theory. So in what follows is a brief sampler of some of the possibilities of reading care in Annel's Ghost. And here I shall pay more attention to the personal than to the political, bearing in mind that the boundary between one and the other is precisely one that care ethicists insist it is necessary to abrogate, like early feminists that they are. Also, in the direction towards particularity and detail, I shall trace in the novel a number of caring gestures with autonomous full value in and of themselves. The plot in Annel's Ghost is triggered, as we saw yesterday, and as you know, by Annel's return to the island, which sets it all in motion. Annel, I claim, has what Nell Noddings calls a caring as a moral way of life. She is a forensic anthropologist, and it is difficult to understand this profession without connecting it to concern for others. Whether this general concern for others qualifies as care can be examined, since, as Virginia Health claims, people who care are not acting for the sake of all others or humanity in general, but to particular others. However, for Joan Toronto, care is a complex set of practices which range from very intimate ones, such as maternal thinking, to extremely broad practices, such as devised in public systems of education. In any event, all other human beings could be considered a particular other in a time whose drama, as we read in the novel, and I quote, is the coming of all men into one fate. Annel's job is to identify the corpses of people assassinated in violent regimes. In the first scene of the novel, we see her working in Guatemala. One morning, she finds a woman crouching next to 2 corpses lying in a burial site that the team is working on. These corpses are the woman's lost husband and her brother. With her forensic intervention, identifying the bodies and the form in which the 2 men were murdered, Annel is mitigating the pain of that woman. This is an example of how forms of what might be thought of as impersonal care always end up constituting caring gestures for particular others. And the scene, of course, also constitutes a mise en abîme of the whole plot of the novel, as we know. Annel's journey in the novel, it was also mentioned yesterday, is one of coming back to her birthplace to end up, after 15 years of living abroad and estrangement, recognizing herself as one of us. In applying for this job and going back to Sri Lanka, she's willing to take care of her own kind. This idea, taking care of her own kind, may sound parochial or partisan. Joan Toronto signals that together with paternalism, parochialism is one of the dangers to inadequacy of care. Daniel Engster documents that biologically, we are prepared to care for those we consider our kin, but not so others. Therefore, our natural tendency to care for each other needs to be complemented with further ethical considerations. Apologies about this. Beyond the innate, through what he calls the performativity of care. That is, care needs to be performed. And this in turn contributes to what is called circles of care and the expanding circles of care. Also, Nell Noddings insists that care needs to be cultivated and promoted in pedagogical form if we want to reach beyond our partisan minds and affections. Spanish philosopher Victoria Camps discusses how self-care is an imperative point of departure if one wishes to care for others. And this is a bone of contention. There are different opinions on this. In this regard, while she shows concern for others, I'm not sure Anil manages to take good care of herself. She falls prey to an unhappy marriage first, to an frustrating relationship with a married man later on, although we must concede that she manages to escape both damaging relations. She establishes a more nurturing relationship with her friend Liv, her closest friend and companion, whom she loves and who she is loved by. However, as we know, Liv stops calling her in a sort of abandon, in which Liv looks for somebody else, her sister, to take the care that Anil could perhaps provide for her. Thus, what we see is a character rather ambiguous. Anil is a very solitary character, but I would say it is out of necessity that she is so lonely. Like other scholars have done earlier and yesterday, return to Sri Lanka, I claim that return to Sri Lanka constitutes the beginning of some kind of healing process for her. She wants to regain a sense of belonging and also a sense of usefulness in the plagued context of war. In the novel, we see Anil indulging in cleansing baths on different occasions, episodes which seem to genuinely comfort her. The most meticulous one she performs after having saved Ananda from his attempted suicide, which is an extraordinary caring gesture. After that strenuous evening, she dreams that she is with Sarath and Ananda, who in her dream is going to be saved, to be cured, to be cared for by a good man. We can conclude that at the symbolic age of 33, Anil is ready to take care of herself, and therefore is better endowed than ever to take care of others. To quote Victoria Camps, self-care informs our way to encounter the world, our behavior, and our form of establishing relations with others. Anil soon meets Sarath, who will take care of her to the last consequences. He is an honest person, presented as an honest person. His integrity transpires some of his comments about the war. I don't join one side or the other, he says. He doesn't really take sides. At the same time, he doesn't eschew his responsibility on the carnage when he says, now we all have blood in our hands. Now, these widely quoted statements. In the midst of this carnage, and unlike Anil, protected by her international passport, he is completely vulnerable. In typical Ondaatjian manner, because, well, Ondaatje is an expert, right, in drawing these secret connections among different threads in the narratives that he writes. Sarath's tragic end is surreptitiously announced early on through the character of Guatemalan Manuel, about whom we read in the early pages of Anil's story that she says he is part of that community, so he has less protection than the others like us, thus announcing what is to happen later on to Sarath. Although initially Anil mistrusts his political allegiances, from the beginning he shows a caring attitude towards her. We see this in mundane details, like reminding her to take her pills, planning to buy her a more appropriate hat, checking her pulse, and so on. But also he is cautioning her in a political sense, warning her not to speak when she may be hurt, or cautioning her about the army patrols they meet. He also comforts her emotionally after the episode of Ananda's attempted suicide. Then, of course, he rescues her literally by the end of the novel, right? And then Sarath also cares about his brother Gamini, in spite of the secret wars between the two men, particularly over the matter of women, but also of family. Sarath seems to monitor his brother with discretion in his typical style. He knows where to find him exactly at hospital, and he's concerned. He shows concern when Gamini is abandoned by his wife. Now, can we take concern as care? While some authors discard notions of care when it does not involve action, Nell Noddings distinguishes between caring about, meaning having ideas or intentions to care for others, and caring for, which is the actual labor of caring, taking care for others. And she deems both aspects as necessary in the whole enterprise of care. No matter how we understand this attitude of Sarath's towards his brother, we can say that Sarath displays, like Anil, a caring disposition. Surely it could not be otherwise in a character whose main defining feature physically is his generous breast. And to finish this quick survey, while Sarath is the caregiver, his brother, nicknamed the Mouse, Gamini, is in constant need of care. In contrast to his brother composure and broad-chest, Gamini is unhappy, mercurial, and physically fragile, in need of pills, poorly fed and rest, and like Anil, unable to care for himself adequately. Ever unable to find haven in worldly affections, as you know, and as we know, he falls in love with his brother's wife. He's abandoned by his own wife, and then he falls in love with a nurse who cannot correspond him, but with brotherly love. The first time we see Gamini in the hospital ward, he is a man wearing a black coat, blood on his clothes, waiting for someone to help him. And one of the most telling passages about him also discloses his yearning for care. I quote, "He wanted a mother's arm to hold him firm on the bed, to lie across his ribcage, to bring a cool washcloth to his face." I argued before that motherly love constitutes the paradigmatic form of care. Far from casually, images of mothers with their babies, holding their babies, are scattered on those pages which take us close to the battlefield. As a reminder that chains of care sustain human life also in these harsh conditions. Gamini, the forsaken mouse, needs the proximity of others to confirm his own presence. He cannot sleep without noise or people around. He never leaves the hospital. In Buverian or Levinatian manner, it is through the proximity of others, of the other, that he is reassured of his own existence. And I quote, "Sleeping in the woods, he could be one limb of a large creature, linked to the others by the thread of noises." So he embodies a depiction of humankind which only exists in relation with others, which can be only part of a whole. And this is the relationality pointed to by care ethicists, the germinating ground for care. For all his restless and addictions, at one point Sarath tells that his brother has found some kind of balance. And this is surely so because of his profession. As a doctor, he saves lives on a daily basis. In real life, care has traditionally been connected to women and to health professionals. And of course, also in fiction, often health workers are presented as literal as well as poetic restorers of health and also of a sense of humanity in a wider ontological sense. This is surely what saves Gamini and even of himself, what sustains his precarious balance. While he lives in a sort of affective despondency where he cannot care for himself and yearns to be cared, he finds relief in taking care of others. The 12-year-old's heart operation reads up as epitome of Gamini's role of caregiver for the living. And he also takes care of the dying, as he does constantly with anonymous victims of the war, and also when, in a narrative close-up, we see him trying to unsuccessfully save the life of the woman he loves. Anel's ghost climatic moment occurs when Gamini is seen as caregiver for the dead. Namely, when in the last pages of the novel, he finds his murdered brother's corpse and begins to cure it from all its past wounds. In this extraordinary passage, the ambivalent function of care in the context of the novel is powerfully underscored. And I quote, I read this passage, "He began washing the body's dark brown markings with scrub lotion. He could heal his brother, set the left leg, deal with every wound as if he were alive. as if treating the 100 small traumas would eventually bring him back into his life. Now, is not Sarath dead already? And similarly, what is the worth of attempting to discern caring moments in narratives which visit contexts pervaded by the horror of wars and mass murder? What can be done after death but mourning? Further, the passage ends with the superposition of this with yet another scene of frantic arrival of bodies to hospital coming from a bombing somewhere in the city. Thus, all in all, is not all this care drowned in a sea of violence? Is not care in this context blatantly ineffective? And yet, I want to claim that in such war contexts, care is precisely all that rests in the double sense of the term, remains, pacifies. As Maurice Hamilton reminds us, caring is so basic to human development and the survival of human civilizations that the resource potential to it is present even when it is suppressed. To conclude, in Anil's Ghost, caring gestures are featured in multiple forms and dimensions, from apparently minor to immense, from the nurse's soft touch on Gamini's arm while he is operating the child, to Sarath's delicate treatment of Sailor, from Ananda's soothing embrace to Anil, to her saving his life, from Palipana's rescue of his grandniece Lakshma when she is plagued by sorrow, to the child's reciprocation in his senile days and death. There is no question that two outstanding gestures are rescuing Sailor from oblivion, and thus naming the rest, which is a form of taking us to the beginning of the novel and to the beginning of the paper, and also Ananda's reconstruction of Sailor's face into a serene countenance, as a means to return to his disappeared wife and all the other victims the peace they deserve. In Anil's Ghost, a texture of care is superimposed onto one of destruction and horror. As I suggested in my abstract, the result is an amazing literary feat, although one which does not occlude the tragic moral failure of any armed conflict. And to conclude, notwithstanding all things said, care redeems us. In spite of renouncing the world after losing his wife, Sarath, and I quote, would have given his life for the truth if the truth were of any use. And in an ultimate grandiose caring gesture, which subverts the overpowering economy of war, he eventually does. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Isabel.
Thank you.
Loved your performativity of care, which you brought up in theoretical aspects. But those of us who have dressed a dead relative, a dear one, I think we understand acutely the pain felt by Gamini in the chapter that you, in the passage that you read out from that evocative chapter. Thank you so much, Isabel. I'm looking forward to Dr. Lakshmi A.K.'s paper after yours, because it also gestures towards the issues that you have brought up in a different kind of way. So Dr. Lakshmi A.K., without further ado, she's the Associate Professor, Department of English, Government Victoria College, Palakkad, and her paper title is Representation of History in Anil's Ghost. Go ahead, Lakshmi. Please try and keep to the 14 to 15 minute time limit. We have Professor Goldman's keynote address after yours. Go ahead.
So now the problem here is Ondaatje himself says, we all know that this is a fiction. I mean, this is a novel. And how can I search for history in a novel? And Ondaatje in his author's note says that this consists of some invented events. The author's note is here. Yes. So Anil's Ghost, I quote from what Ondaatje said, Anil's Ghost is a fictional work set during this political time and historical, and what existed organizations similar to those in the story, and similar events took place. The characters and incidents in the novel are invented. So with this author's note, I am trying to find history, and that might be rather bizarre for real literary lovers. But then this novel came out. It was published in 2000, and it was set in Sri Lanka during a political moment. And then naturally we look for history. My research was on historical appropriations, and this text was included there. But in my research, I studied about the historiographic metafiction, the theory given by Linda Hutcheon. Now here, when I look at this history, what I do is, because of the brevity of time, I introduce an idea that was given to us by Noel Carroll in his essay, Periodizing Postmodernism. Now, according to Noel Carroll, there are 3 time schemes in any history writing. Whether it is history or historical fiction, we can assume this as a historical fiction novel. And there is these 3 time schemes where, according to Noel Carroll, it is T1, T2, and T3. T1 means actual event, T2 means the subsequent events, and T3 is the position of the historian when he wrote this text. Now, in our terms, from T1, T2, T3 might look rather scientific or technological. So for our usage, maybe I can translate that with the help of Chu Chue Cheng, when that person wrote about Kazuo Ishiguro. This can be translated into narrating present, narrated past, and authorial present. So by authorial present means the publication of the book. And that is year 2000 when this book got published. And narrating present means the present, all the present events that happened in the novel, that is from the moment of Anil Tisera's coming to Colombo until her return from Colombo, and those events or everything that happens in the text in Anil's present, Anil being the main protagonist, could be regarded as a narrating present. And the narrated past means all those events that happened in the past, like remembered cruelties, or like the stories that are narrated, legends of Linus Correa, then Sirisa, etc. And even the story of sailor, Ruwan Kumara. Now, all those events that happened before the arrival of Anil can be regarded as a narrated past. So, narrated past forms the first time scheme, and narrating present, Anil's arrival in the text will be the second time scheme, and the authors or readers present, that is the readers novel. So, the problem which, and this paper had a lot of critical remarks from the communication which I had with Dr. Julie Mehta. We discussed about how critics looked upon this novel, and but many of them, I am thankful to Dr. Aparna Hadde, who mentioned a number of critics like Kadri Ismail who had problems with this text. So I'm not going to that because I'm saved of that time of referring to critics who are not very happy with Ondaatje. So, according to some critics, they didn't get what they expected from this novel, and the reason for that, I assume, is that this text was published in year 2000, and during the time, Western media, we knew that there was some civil war was going on, some problem was going on in Sri Lanka. But to the Western media, or maybe we live in India, I live in India, so for people who are outside Colombo or outside Sri Lanka, it was a problem between Sri Lankan government and LTTE, Tamil separatists. There was this insurgency, and those episodes were not, those Western readers were not aware of these episodes. And so they were looking for what Ondaatje, this world cosmopolitan writer, had to speak about this issue between the Tamils and Sri Lankan government. But Ondaatje, on the other hand, placed his novel in this that 1987 to 1989 JVP coup, and of course there are some Tamils in this novel, but Kadri Ismail had a great problem that most of the major characters like Anil, Gamini, Sharath, Ananda, and these people had a problem also that they had Sinhala names, Buddhist names, and there is this, he was pro-Sinhalese, and he was again, many Tamils didn't feature into that novel. That was a problem, and that I think we discussed that with, there was a discussion between myself, Dr. Julie and myself. And so what I wanted to say is that when this novel came out, this problem, that is the JVP issue, was crushed. JVP leader Rohana Vijayveera was killed in 1989 in November, and along with that movement was crushed. And JVP was as a political party, it was a leftist political party that later joined the democratic, it joined into a coalition of Sri Lankan politics. And now when the reader, for the first reader, that is how it is, that is the real time of the novel marked by its publication characterizes a time that is external to the text, but which could have largely shaped the perceptions of the original readers. So that is the problem. That is, I find that the real reader thought that this was about LTTE, and they were looking forward to this, and they had this issue. So what was Ondaatje really trying to tell us, which I understand, is I draw allusions to Harshana's speech, where he was trying to give us a cosmopolitan picture. There are references to Guatemala, Congo, Geneva, etc., where government had interference in the civilian matter, and he was presenting us with a civilian history. He was not taking sides with anybody, and this civilian history was also a medical history, and he has a number of doctors into this text, like Lenas Correa, then Gamini, then Skanda, then a number of doctors are there, and all the description of the historical description, he doesn't use any of the fictional characters. Now, when I studied this novel and I compare this with some of the earlier novels written by Ondaatje, like In the Skin of a Lion or English Patient, we had some real life characters, real historical characters like Almashi, Ambrose Small, Harris, etc., are there in these earlier novels, but in Anna's Ghost, we don't have any historical characters except for certain symbolical representations. We can say that Padugala is a representative of Premadasa, but Ondaatje doesn't give us any real incidents. Everything is fictionalized. Now, also upon Googling, I found out there was an incident that took place in the Pereira University, which was changed in 1989 by Syriza's experience. Syriza's missing us that. I mean, a number of experiences. I mean, he's just changed, fictionalized the real events. So he gave us a fiction based on a particular time in Sri Lanka, and that was a great problem to the critics. So this was a turbulent period in the socio-cultural scenario of the island nation as a result of the raging warfare between Sinhalese Gan and the Tamil separatists. In fact, civil war that is progressing from 1983 would end only in 2009 with the victory of the Sri Lankan army and the reclamation of LTTE strongholds of the north and east of the island. The year 2000 coincided. That is the problem that I found in this in the critics' remarks. The year 2000 coincided with a series of LTTE offensives that included the capture of the A9 highway between Kandy and Jaffna and the Sri Lankan military base at Elephant Pass Isthmus, two strategically important sites for the Tamil separatists. This was the third phase of the Elam War, in which the LTTE victories outnumbered those of the SLA. It is only in the fourth phase from 2006 to 2009 that the SLA gained upper hand, leading to the complete downfall of the Tamil Tigers. So this novel came somewhere in the middle of this Elam War, and people wanted Ondaatje to speak about, give a judgment on that, and Ondaatje was refusing to provide any judgment. And he was there is an interview he gave to Maya Jaggi where he said that this is part of a global issue. So he finds this only as an episode, a mere episode in the global terrorism problem. So this is happening everywhere. And that is a stand I understand Ondaatje took, and that was a problem. So there we find that there is now when I study history consists of a lot of exclusions as well as inclusions. So there are some exclusions in Ondaatje as well. And one of the exclusion there are Tamil characters, but Tamil characters are rather insignificant. But that was one of the criticism that Ondaatje had to face in this novel. But Tamil characters, although they are very few, there are 3 Tamil characters in this text. One is Lalita, that was Anil's Aya. And another one, Anil and Lalita had a very close relationship. She called Lalita when her marriage broke up. There was a phone call she had with Lalita, and she also went to see her at the beginning of this novel. Then the second character is a Tamil nurse with whom on a little boy, and then the third is a description of Gamini's experience in Trincomalee when he was sort of kidnapped by the Tamil separatists. Now, there was a reference to Linus Correa's kidnap, but that was by the insurgents, JVP insurgents that happened in Colombo. And this is compared. So naturally, we will compare. These two are doctors, and when Linus Correa was kidnapped by insurgents, he had to face a lot of cruel treatment from the insurgents, whereas Gamini's experience was a bit softer when compared to that of Linus Correa. So we feel that Ondaatje was not very harsh against Tamils. He presents them with, and these separatists who kidnap Gamini, they are presented as 17-year-old, 16-year-old youngsters, and they are not as harsh to Gamini as the insurgents were to Linus Correa. So we feel they are quite friendly and they are fighting for some odd cause, and that's the impression we get. So Ondaatje sort of had he was a bit pacifying towards the Tamils. And then another issue that I found in the text was that, as Harshana, Dr. Harshana said yesterday, there are no Muslims in the text, and even though Muslim population consists some 9% of the total Sri Lankan population, then he presents history can be divided, studied in various other forms like military history, political history. He doesn't say anything about politics, so politics is totally excluded. He just writes his novel on the basis of the civilian history, but that is later from 1950s onwards, civilian history or writing from the below, people's history. We have an example as Anne Frank's history. Anne Frank's autobiography is regarded as an example of this people's history, people's opinion or people's point of perspective towards war. That kind of a history is what I guess Ondaatje was presenting in his novel. And so there are exclusions and there are as well as inclusions, because if you expected a novel, if you expected Ondaatje to speak against Tamils, he didn't do that. He was quite soft with them. Then exclusion of Tamil characters. One major exclusion that I found in this text was that of IPKF, Indian Peacekeeping Force, because this particular coup of JVP had an immediate cause was the Indian Peacekeeping Force going to Sri Lanka, and that Indo-Sri Lankan Accord that happened in 1987 was one of their immediate reason to. Between 1987 to 1989, I understand, was marked with this war among all these sides. That is separatists fighting against the Sri Lankan government and IPK fighting against, IPK fighting against the Sri Lankan LTTE and Sri Lankan government fighting against insurgents. So this kind of warfare was going on, but this novel doesn't tell us anything about IPKF. So it's completely silent about that. And so they provide us with a lot of medical history, what kind of weapons are used and the results created by these weapons, and that is elaborated. The conclusion is this: Ondaatje did have included certain things, and he had excluded certain things also. Just as you said in our earlier conversation, further lacunae are created. And that kind of I'm sure that we cannot create a complete history. The history that Ondaatje presented, he might have his own reasons for representing Sri Lankan history as he did in this novel. And that is his version. I mean, there are different versions. There will be many versions, and if we can take all those versions, we can form a comprehensive history of Sri Lanka. But then still there will be further gaps and lacunae, and that problem can never be dealt with. That's what I guess.
Wonderful explication, Lakshmi. Really, you've hit at the heart of the matter. Very few scholars want to get into this on a public forum, but without being political, you've stated the facts and put them on the table. I have so much to share with my experience at the University of Toronto teaching this novel and the classroom skirmishes that were almost bordering on a battlefield of sorts. But I will hold my peace and we will talk about it after Professor Marlene Goldman's much awaited, eagerly awaited keynote lecture. Harish, please take it over. Thank you.
So at this stage of the proceedings, we go into another segment, and this is the keynote address for this evening, to be delivered by Professor Marlene Goldman, Professor of English at the Department of English at the University of Toronto. Dr. Marlene Goldman teaches at the University of Toronto. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, who specializes in Canadian literature, age studies, and medieval humanities. She recently completed a book called Forgotten Age, Related Dementia and Alzheimer's in Canadian Literature, on the intersection between narrative and pathological modes of forgetting associated with trauma, dementia, and Alzheimer's disease, brought out by the McGill Queen's Press in 2017. She is currently writing a book called Performing Shame, Simulating Stigmatized Minds and Bodies. In addition to her scholarly works, she has also written, directed, and produced a short film about dementia entitled Piano Lessons, based on Alice Munro's short story, In Sight of the Lake, from her collection Dear Life of 2004. Her latest film, Torching the Dusties, about aging and intergenerational warfare, from Margaret Atwood's recent collection Stone Mattress 2014, premiered at the Fright Festival in London, UK. She is the author of Paths of Desire, University of Toronto Press, 1997, Rewriting Apocalypse, McGill Queen's Press, 2005, and Dispossession, McGill Queen's Press, 2011. In her keynote address, the title of her keynote address is, very interestingly, The Art of Gothic Detection in Ondaatje's Corpus. And she will be addressing Ondaatje's troubled relationship with his father, which is powerfully evoked in Letters and Other Worlds, a poem in which the narrator likens his father's body to a globe of fear, which is the top note of this conference. So over to Professor Marlene Goldman to deliver her keynote address.
I want to just thank the organizers so much for this honor and for this opportunity. It feels like we're in a globe of fear sometimes, and I realize that we can choose what we focus on and how we approach, a kind of, in this case, I feel like we're living out so many sort of issues of Gothic detection, but I just want to say I have just rarely had an opportunity to meet people who are so warm and empathetic about the personal, and who were so invested in sort of intellectual and scholarly pursuits. So it's just a pleasure to be met as a whole person. So Julie, who kind of asked me about my family first, and Harish, thank you so much. So I'm going to really speak along lines that have been discussed. And I'm so sorry I wasn't able to join you the other day. I just had a full roster of teaching and meetings, which was unfortunate, because this would have been such a much more stimulating place in some ways to be. So I want to talk as a formalist. I want to approach not so much the historical concerns. I'm going to argue from formal angles and see how this works, that a lot of critical debate about Ondaatje's kind of work is coming out of, in some ways, just a decision to ignore the genres that he's actually employing, and as a writer really signaling certain kinds of formal trajectories. But I loved Aparna's, owing to post-colonial rage, people aren't reading, they're really reacting. And I think the one thing that we can really use is, in most situations when we're so eager to be reactive, is just this ability to read carefully and to engage in a dialogue, as opposed to projecting some kind of narcissistic monologue. So I invite everyone to, in the spirit of care, which is so important and takes so many forms, and I felt it here, in a spirit of care and dialogue, and speaking across worlds with a lot of misunderstanding inevitably involved in that, just to let me know your thoughts and how you see the world from where you stand. So I'm arguing that it's a given that Ondaatje's Gothic texts conjure specters and stage encounters between the living and the dead. This is a very common trope for people who have left part of their selves behind, and potentially that engenders it. And certainly, and Christopher Ondaatje and Michael's relationship with the father has absolutely primed. I mean, he literally has a dead father. And I was looking for the quotation where Christopher said, my father fell down drunk, and Michael made him into this mythical figure. So how we see the dead and how we commune the dead is very personal and idiosyncratic. So, we've spoken about running in the family, and the sort of narrator's obsession with returning to to commune with the dead and to speak with the living takes him to Sri Lanka. And obviously in this book that was spoken about so eloquently, Anil Tessera, she comes back to do her work, but she is really equally concerned about her father, her deceased father. So I'm going to argue, and it's just a hypothesis. I'm not trying to master anything at this point. I want to share an idea, and people have been generously sharing ideas. So I suggest that Anil's Ghost registers an important shift in Ondaatje's writing from a kind of more localized preoccupation with elusive, unstable individual parental figures. I mean, people like Buddy Bolden, who are father figures and then they disappear. And so not just the figures themselves, but the traumas they endured, and then as a kind of intergenerational haunting they engender. And I think that he moves in this text in a really important way to an overarching fascination with a traumatized nation. And there are problems with that move because they're metaphorical, but I think that they're also productive. So Anil's quest to learn about her father is carried out in the context of a nation in which we're told hosts of people simply started disappearing. And so I really appreciate the sense that he is talking about a kind of condition. And I, as an affect theorist, and as a really committed to the Gothic and trauma narratives, really approaching literature from formal perspectives, really think that this formal decision on his part is really doing certain things. And obviously genres don't do everything. So it's not doing the kinds of work that certain critics want. And I'm going to be arguing that they're not reading the genre, which is very pompous, but I think you need to read a little bit more carefully. So I would posit that Anil's Ghost relies on a very uneasy juxtaposition, not just of two, but three distinct genres: the Gothic, trauma narrative, and something that Ondaatje loves, detective fiction. And the scope of this talk doesn't really allow me to talk about his investment in this novel in both classic and postmodern detective fiction. So when I speak about detective fiction in a longer sort of chapter length text, I talk about both because traces of both are present. But here I'm going to just be focusing on his excitement and investment in postmodern detection. So taken together, these three genres have and should have an impact on readers' expectations. So I argue that you've got within this novel a really interesting set of impulses that are engineered by the genres. On the one hand, you've got Gothic and trauma narratives, and they heighten the reader, and by well, the characters inside are driven by Gothic concerns and matters of trauma. So first you've got the characters being driven by the Gothic impulses, and then extension, this kind of shifts to the reader. So there is a desire to uncover a truth and find the Gothic secret. Anyone who reads Edgar Allan Poe really wants to know who's in the wall, you know, like what happened. And so there is a sense that there is a singular truth that's going to emerge. And in this case, it's the truth in the novel concerning the characters' traumatic experiences. And these are linked to unresolved crimes associated with, and people mention the historical context in Lanka. So I won't speak to that. My work has been done. Thank you. So the desire for truth that's mobilized by these two very powerful genres is challenged by the text's equally apparent reliance on postmodern detection. And so why should this matter? Well, as people have been repeatedly discussing, readers and critics, you know, especially early on, faulted the text on, and not just the text, but the author, on ethical grounds for not revealing the truth, the singular truth about atrocities committed by the government. And I'm like, whoa. I argued this in so many ways. I argued that there were, if you were an assiduous reader, you could find really important information about Buddhist involvement. Like this wasn't a cover-up, this wasn't, but I'm coming back to that. I'm kind of circling around again and say, let's take another look and examine the text's formal tensions, specifically hermeneutical instabilities generated by the text's explicit invocation from tropes from postmodern detection. And I just kind of love it. I always have felt that Ondaatje's novels stage kind of important debates that reflect critical debates. It's like he sort of stages within the confines of the novel and the genre, just kind of here's experiments in how we could think. We could have a desire for the truth that's very simplistic, and then we could have a recognition that the sifting together of clues, and you see this in some ways in The English Patient, is more like turning over cards and matching things. And the subjective art of matching things, you know, comes with risks. Anyway, I'll stick to this novel. But I really loved Chelva's point that the novel's reliance on what I'm calling Gothic detection as a kind of new genre precludes the revelation of a singular truth. And I'm thinking of Chelva's point that this is really appropriate in many ways, given Ondaatje's ambivalent subject position as a burgher. And so Chelva put it best, I think, when he said, probing one's identity is problematic in the best of situations, let alone in the case of one, Ondaatje, who is seen, and this is critical for me, as both the agent and victim of colonial hegemony. So he's not arguing that we can find a singular locus for the author himself. And I'm saying that that's really beautifully reflected in the kind of choice of genres, the impossibility of locating oneself, and with that, having a sort of access to pure truth. So I'm going to complicate this by talking first about how the Gothic, and then very briefly how trauma narratives have been kind of viewed as offering that possibility of truth. And then I'll close with a discussion of how this is kind of undermined by the kind of formal elements and motifs in Gothic detective narratives. So Anil's Ghost signals its depth to the Gothic, which is understood more of a mode than a genre, most obviously through its repeated references to two central Gothic motifs. The first is the unspeakable, and the second is the related experience of being buried alive. And so I've done a lot of work on the Gothic, and I'm just choosing these two tropes. And I could mention a lot more, but we'll leave it at that. So Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick explains, at its simplest, the unspeakable appears on almost every page. And she cites unutterable horror, unspeakable. These are the intensifying adjective of choice in these types of novels. She argues further that Gothic novels typically deal with, quote, things that are naturally difficult to talk about, like guilt. But they describe the difficulty not in terms of resistances that may or may not be overcome, but in terms of an absolute, often institutional prohibition or imperative. The important privation, Sedgwick maintains, is the privation exactly of language. So what has occurred becomes, on a kind of political level, unspeakable. And so the unspeakable in Anil's Ghost really does assume a politically and racially inflected valence in the context of the historical moment. So while in Sri Lanka, you've got Anil working with her co-investigator, the archaeologist Sarath, and we know the plot. They discover Sailor. His identity is unknown, but he's found in a sacred site. The body was moved. It's a present kind of crime that's been kind of sort of placed over top of other bodies. And so the point that Anil makes is that he is one victim in all the turbulent history of the island's recent civil wars, in all the token police investigations. Not one murder charge had been made during the Troubles. Hence, in comparison to prior investigations, she states this could be a clear case against the government. And so their predicament, I argue further, echoes that of central characters in the Gothic who occupy conflicted positions that reveal them as being, and I quote Sedgwick, haunted by a second unconscious of deep-seated social and historical dilemmas, often of many types at once, that become more and more fearsome the more characters and readers attempt to cover them up or reconcile them symbolically without resolving them fundamentally. So I think it's so interesting that, and I'm just going to digress briefly, in Sedgwick's completely unrelated comments about the Gothic, she talks about this desire to resolve things symbolically, make him answer, make the author give a symbolic answer so that we can kind of feel as if we've dealt with the Sri Lankan complicated civil war. Anyway, so resolution is desperately sought because the Gothic is driven by an uncanny form of justice that extends beyond the grave. Only that which has been treated as human, the text seems to say, can be properly buried. if you try to bury that which has been denied its human rights to begin with, then there is no possibility that the stone will remain in place. And these are comments from Gothic formalists who understand the calls for justice. So Anil's attempt to resolve deep-seated historical and social dilemmas mirror the Gothic's paradigmatic tension between the taboo against speaking about past crimes and the demand for justice. So Anil admits that while, quote, she had come to expect clearly marked roads to the source of most mysteries, and while she previously believed that information could always be clarified and acted upon here on this island, she realized she was moving with only one arm of language among uncertain laws and a fear that was everywhere. So you have the privation of language, the unspeakable made literal, in accordance with the Gothic. And there's also an awareness that owing to knowledge can't be shared, owing to the real threat that if expressed, the results will be lethal. And so what she says, in a fearful nation, public sorrow was stamped down by the climate of uncertainty. If a father protested a son's death, it was feared another family member would be killed. If people you knew disappeared, there was a chance they might stay alive if you did not cause trouble. So this same fear precludes unguarded conversations between Anil and Sereth. We see this modeled in the text in terms of an entire relationship that unfolds right to the end. So we know that because of the unspeakable, when Sereth is absent for 6 days, Anil panics, blurts out compromising information to Dr. Pereira, and her rash behavior actually instigates Sereth's murder, an outcome that emphasizes the relationship between communication and violence in Gothic narratives. And what Sedgwick says is the real terror of the unspeakable, and I quote, has to do with the violence greeting any attempt to pass an originally arbitrary barrier, one imposed by institutional prohibition. So Sedgwick argues further that because of this arbitrary yet entrenched prohibition, I'm just going to just pause and 1 sec, just give me 1 sec. My mail is dinging and I'm so sorry, but I hear it and I'm hoping that you don't have to. So Sedgwick says the self in Gothic fiction is blocked off from something to which it normally ought to have access. That something can be its own past, the details of its family history, the national history as well. It can be the free air when the self has literally been buried alive. So this prohibition against speech in the Gothic dovetails with its sort of second central motif, which is live burial. And again, I don't really need to rehearse the plot for you, but in this text, so I'm proving that the Gothic is really operating. So you've got the unspeakable, you've got live burial. And so we have in the novel, with respect to the live burial, it's the past that's buried alive owing to fear and bodies. So it's literal and figurative. Literal, the past is buried. Figuratively, bodies have been buried alive. And it works across as a kind of diffuse metaphor, because early on the narrator portrays Anil and Sereth as buried each in himself owing to fear. Later, Sereth extends this sensation to the nation as a whole. Half the world, he said, was being buried, the truth hidden by fear. The country existed in a rocking, self-burying motion. And the most gruesome example, I think, of this trope of live burial is in fact linked to Sailor's death and Sereth's death. So after analyzing his body, Anil tells Sereth that Sailor was barely dead when they tried to burn him. So burning and burial. And then finally, Sereth's final words, and it's really interesting how caring, and you made me really think that caring and violence and the unspeakable are kind of at the opposite ends of the spectrum. So I really appreciate being able to think in ways that kind of let me see alternatives, even as I'm focusing on the Gothic terrors. So Sereth, he speaks his final words. We don't even receive them. But he speaks them from a subterranean tunnel. And it's really interesting because I think that there is a rescue of his words, and he makes a profound sacrifice. So the getting at the truth, I think, there's always a cost in speaking. There's always a risk. And I think we see that with respect to Sereth. So again, I'm just anatomizing the text like a body so that it doesn't become buried alive by critics who don't understand the form. And so I just think, yes, there is a desire to unbury, and it's a desire that is further enhanced by trauma narratives. So I'm going to just tell you very briefly that trauma theory posits, and this is Kathy Caruth's version of trauma, and she had a lot of really positive things that she contributed, but she had a very particular view of trauma that really pulls against. I work in health science, and so I work with a ton of neurologists, and I'm doing a lot of work, and they don't view brains or trauma the way humanists do. And in fact, the closest person who really understands trauma is probably Ruth Lays. And so she's written a lot of work. And if anyone's interested in trauma theory, she really wrote a book that kind of challenges the kind of lack of scientific accuracy in Caruth's view. But anyway, I'm giving you Caruth first, because I think the novel actually, interestingly, writes against simplistic notions of trauma. So Caruth says, the victim of a traumatic event is unable to process the experience in a normal way. And as a result, the event leaves what Caruth describes as a reality imprint in the brain. In its insistent literality, it intensifies to the existence of a pristine and timeless historical truth, undistorted or uncontaminated by subject meaning, personal cognitive schemes, psychosocial factors, or unconscious elaboration. I've taught trauma theory at undergraduate and graduate level, and I basically think it's as if a shard of history is kind of lodged in the person's flesh as envisaged by Caruth. And this theory was profoundly in vogue in the humanities in the 80s and the 90s, and probably when the novel came out and people were looking for this shard of truth. Let's go get it, And so it conceives of trauma victims as entirely passive, possessed by the truth that returns in flashbacks and nightmares in the form of pristine fragments of missing history. So this theory of traumatic memory has really come under fire. It's been effectively challenged. I want to say dismantled by contemporary neuroscience, but no, it's a zombie theory because it never dies. We're so invested in getting the truth that theories that say we can't have it and demonstrate that we can't have it, forget it. Anyway, so Anil's Ghost, its invocation of trauma and trauma narratives in conjunction with the Gothic, I'm saying understandably lead readers to expect a kind of singular truth. And those who fault the novel for not revealing a specific kind of monolithic version of historical truth about the war, I think they're also clinging to a very dubious account of trauma theory that suggests that these memories remain absolutely true to the event. So I'm understanding that there's a kind of drive to uncover a Gothic secret, and that there's a drive to find the traumatic event. But even within, I don't even need postmodern Gothic detection, the detective, to suggest that these, even within the Gothic, it's understood that this is a problematic endeavor because of the violence that's unleashed. So people looking at these genres say there's warnings within the genres themselves that any quest for a simplistic truth is dangerous and potentially foolish. You know, it's not available. So I'm going to say just briefly, people who have studied trauma demonstrate that traumatic memories are inevitably and always contaminated by the context in which they're recalled. And I'm thinking that this discussion about how trauma works really speaks to the kind of wonderful talk that was just given about the history of the book's reception, right? So it was received in, you know, kind of 2000, and that moment colored, you know, people's response to the text in a particular way. So I'm making an analogy that trauma is always going to be, and the memories are always going to be inflected by the moment that they're recovered. Anyway, so put differently, the process by which, you know, the clues to the traumatic event and the moment when they are gathered and assembled, there's no pristine truth buried in history. It's very much of the present. And so neurologists like Antonio Damaso, many clinicians will say there's always evidence, if you look at traumatic memories, of the kind of inclusion of elements from the present. So we never get the past back. Nevertheless, we're primed to retrieve this because, you know, we know that an injustice has occurred. We know that there's something has happened. So the best way I can think about accounting for the incursion of the present on the past is to look at the other genre, the final genre of classic detection and postmodern detection. So briefly, classic detection, the retrieval of truth concerning a crime depends on the detective's ability to occupy the realm of pure thought. And I think of, you know, the fascination with Sherlock Holmes. You know, he just sits somewhere and just kind of thinks about the crime and, you know, can think it through. The cogito is just so powerful. And so it becomes a kind of moment of puzzle solving. In postmodern detection, by contrast, the sleuth finds herself propelled into the crime scene and as a result contaminates the field of inquiry with her subjective presence, sometimes to the extent that the investigation itself produces unexpectedly violent results. So seen through the context or the lens of postmodern detective fictions, Sarah's death can be seen to spring from Anil's failure to recognize that a paradigm shift has occurred, a shift that marks the difference between classical and postmodern modes of detection. So Fred Jameson explains, a formal change occurred in the detective narrative, occurred in this genre, and he identifies it in Raymond Chandler's detective fiction, such that the detective, quote, no longer inhabits the atmosphere of pure thought, of puzzle solving, and the resolution of a given set of elements. On the contrary, he is propelled outwards into the space of his world, end quote. Jameson argues further that in this altered context, quote, once set in motion, the search has unexpectedly violent results. And to borrow his words, quote, the appearance of the detective breaks the balance, sets the various mechanisms of suspicion ringing. So a number of characters in Anil's Ghost warn, including Sareth, warn Anil that it's foolish for her to think of herself as an objective scientific observer. And they insist that her crusade to uncover the truth will inevitably have repercussions on the so-called truth that she uncovers, and in fact may ultimately escalate the violence that she has in her mind innocently come to document. So I think, you know, this issue about care and uncovering clues is really in tension in this novel. And it's not to say that one shouldn't gather information, but recognize almost that the field in which you're gathering information is mined, and other people can blow up because you're treading in very, very dangerous territory. So Gamini tells Sarah it's the wrong time for unburials. They don't want results. They're fighting a war on two sides now, the government. They don't need more criticism. So the field in which the truth is supposedly going to be kind of unburied has to be thought through really carefully. And so Sareth assures his brother that he knows it. Gamini says, but does she? Too many people know about your investigation. There's always someone paying attention. And as a Canadianist, I love the echoes across Ondaatje and Timothy Finley. Finley wrote The Wars and asked people at the end of that beautiful, heartbreaking novel to pay attention. And that's the attention of care, right? That takes kind of history and animates us, and in a sort of Walter Benjamin-like way, sort of rescues the lost potential in one generation because we care for it, and we instantiate some utopian dreams in the present associated with care. But here, paying attention is to recognize that there is also the possibility for violence that comes from a kind of archival exploration. Someone should write this, because I'm thinking of the connections, if they haven't, between the wars and the work of the archivist and Anil and the work of the detective. And one is a labor of care and the other is a labor of blowing up, right? Potentially blowing things up. So painfully aware of Anil's short-sighted belief, you know, that the journey was in getting into the truth, right? That's not necessary. Getting to the truth is not necessarily a form of care. I'm going to create a conversation. Anyway, so we're told, what would the truth bring them into? It was a flame against a sleeping lake of petrol. This is such a well-known quotation, but I think Ondaatje is such a beautiful writer. Sareth had seen truth broken into suitable pieces and used by the foreign press alongside irrelevant photographs, a flippant gesture toward Asia that might lead as a result of this information to new vengeance and slaughter. There were dangers in handing truth to an unsafe city around you. I think about even how the truth has become even more incendiary in a kind of time of social media, where you can get a fragment of the truth and it races like a supersonic bullet and kills so many people as it travels around the world. So truth in its kind of current incarnation is not necessarily associated with justice. So in accordance with Jameson's insight about detective fiction, Gamini and Sareth recognize that the information disclosed by the detective is paradoxically a weapon, a flame against a sleeping lake of petrol that is available to all and sundry in their contests for power. And I think about, on so many meta levels, what are critics invested in? Are they invested in finding out the truth of a country, or in asserting a powerful voice and becoming most powerful? So I see that this text in staging debates about genres is really also kind of in some ways illuminating the sort of extra-textual power contests and violence. Not that loss of reputation is the same as loss of life, but I had a reporter come to me, and this was before Ondaatje had won the kind of Life Booker Award, and said, "Who reads Ondaatje now that he's so politically incorrect?" I said, "I do." And then he was reinstated, you know, by the Booker. Anyway, despite repeated warnings about the repercussions of her quest, Anil fails to recognize that she cannot play the role of the classical detective, that detached instrument of pure logic, because circumstances thrust her into the role of the postmodern detective, agent provocateur and instigator of violence. So owing to her blindness, you know, she's indirectly responsible for Sareth's murder. And then Gamini says again, everyone pays attention. My brother told you that. People knew you were in Colombo the moment you got here. So her tragic error it kind of fulfills another requirement of postmodern detection, in which the apparently guilty person, in this case, I would say she's always suspicious of Sereth being guilty, is in reality innocent. And the apparently most innocent person, this would be Anil, who sees herself as really crusading for the truth, is the guilty one. And I'm citing postmodern detective formal theory. So Anil's complicity in Sereth's murder supports Smitha Kotary's insight that the detective fiction features two murders, the first of which is merely the occasion for the second, committed by the pure and unpunishable murderer, the detective. So the writer J.C. Hamilton explains that the genre features two murders, the second of which is committed by the detective, his weapon, an explosion of truth. And so I would suggest that Anil's blurting out and presentation of her findings at the government hearing constitutes this type of explosion of truth. And it's not to say, I think Sereth really understood that the truth would take out individuals. He wasn't naive, but he was willing to make the sacrifice to power for truth. So I think one always has to say, you know, what are the repercussions of speaking a truth at this particular moment, and to take responsibility. Maybe that's part of care as well. So by underscoring how the appearance of the detective breaks the balance, the novel dramatized the impact of a shift from classical to postmodern or metaphysical detective stories, and signals its allegiance ethically, formally, with the postmodern detective story's non-teleological structure. So Holquist says of this new genre that, you know, postmodern detective narratives are not concerned to have a neat ending in which all the questions are answered and which therefore can be forgotten. Instead, paradoxical as it may seem, the story, and I quote, is not yet written out, not yet completest. It's not a story, it's a process. The reader, if he or she is to experience the book, must do what detectives do, must turn it into a series of objects, must collate the clues the author has provided, and take the risk of hermeneutic interpretation on herself. So just briefly to conclude, I've kind of summarized the uneasy mix of three genres, you know, the Gothic and the trauma narratives, and I would say I'm privileging postmodern Gothic detection. And so we have unspeakable crimes and we have calls for justice. But I think that the texts demand that we defer the truth and leave it to the reader betrays a really important awareness that whatever truths we uncover are always going to be, I would say, influenced in ways that we can't even account by our present situation. So I'm speaking here in a moment of fear, and also aware that I have a slight role in shaping, you know, how we tell this story. And I'm so grateful for all of you to participate in a dialogue about how we carry our stories forward. So thank you.
Marlene, that was a fascinating talk. It was inventive. It pushed us to think in completely uncharted territory with two ideas of yours. And one of them was, I think, something that would have haunted each one of us, the burial of the past, both figuratively as well as, you know, viscerally, bodies, truth, history, and the relationship between these burials. Your ligature with Isabel's talk on care to focus the idea of trauma narratives. And I was thinking, my goodness, were you at that talk by Kathy Caruth when she came to visit us at the University of Toronto, when she spoke about Death and the Maiden? It was almost as if I was hearing Kathy. Amazing. That for me was an aha moment, you know. And the fact that in the genre of the post-modernist sleuth who finds herself pretty much as a subject who becomes a puzzle-solving little busybody right in there, becomes such a subjective construction. And what does that mean for those who want to search for the truth? You know, I won't dwell on this right now, but there are just so many avenues you've opened up for us that a dialogue would be perfect. But I think we'd be smarter to complete the Anil's Ghost segment of the presentations. And we'll come back to your keynote. Gifty Joseph, who's a lecturer at St. Joseph's College, is really following in your wake, Marlene. Her paper is titled Scarred Psyches and Mutilated Bodies, Trauma in Anil's Ghost. So we'll probably get a totally different version. But let's see what we come up with. The paper analyzes Anil's ghost in the light of the Sri Lankan Civil War. And she says that she will invoke Huko, Agamben, and Esposito. So, Gifty, go right ahead. Looking forward.
Good evening, everyone. I shall share my slide. So, contemporary identities are increasingly being articulated around experiences and memories. There are events of insistently unredeemable injury in Anil's ghost. There are also several instances of suffering and woundedness. So in the novel we see this quote, but here it was a more complicated world morally. The darkest Greek tragedies were innocent compared with what was happening here. Heads on stakes, skeletons dug out of a cockpit in Matali. At university, Anil had translated lines from Archilochus. In the hospitality of war, we left them their dead to remember us by. But here there was no such gesture to the families of the dead, not even the information of who the enemy was. So here we see the effect of trauma on family, as well as physical trauma. The trauma left on families, they are everlasting. They just don't go by, and they don't even get the opportunity to get on with the trauma. They don't easily walk by the trauma. And Judith Butler speaks about the proximity between injurability and aggression. There is a chance that the experience of vulnerability and loss might lead to violence and retribution. The juncture of trauma and violence is always unguarded by multiple acts of framing, as Butler foregrounds in one of her works. A seminal author in literary trauma studies, Kathy Cadd, states that trauma theory itself may provide the very link between cultures. A failure to adequately mediate this aftermath of trauma only perpetuates cycles of violence or re-traumatization. It is revealed in the present study that our exposure to trauma is inescapable. Every side was killing and hiding the evidence. The government was not the only one doing the killing. You had and still have 3 camps of enemies, one in the north, 2 in the south, using weapons, propaganda, fear, sophisticated posters, censorship. A couple of years ago, people just started disappearing, or bodies kept being found burned beyond recognition. What we have got here is unknown extrajudicial executions mostly, perhaps by the insurgents or by the government or the guerrilla separatists, murders committed by all sides. So there is terror among the citizens. People are terrified. They don't know what to do. They can't react. And the next part we see, there had been continual emergency from 1983 onwards, racial attacks and political killings. The terrorism of the separatist guerrilla groups who were fighting for a homeland in the north, the insurrection of the insurgents in the south against the government, the counter-terrorism of the special forces against both of them, the disposal of bodies by fire, the hiding and then reburial of corpses. It was a 100 years war with modern weaponry and bikers on sidelines in safe countries, a war sponsored by gun and drug runners. It became evident that political enemies were secretly joined in financial arm deals. The reason for war was war. So there are Orwellian undertones here. We remember Animal Farm in this context. Also, there are situations in which evidences of murder are being hidden. Sometimes, law is on the side of power, not truth. Another quote from the novel is, "The law meant right of the army to kill us." Expositor recognizes that processes of immunization are crucial for the preservation of life. By communitas, he intended public. And this points to mutual obligation. Communitas points to mutual obligation. Modern thought has mobilized notions such as sovereignty, personhood, property, and liberty in order to shield the individual from the risk of contagion by the unpredictable effects of communitas. For Esposito, biopolitics means the attempt to protect and contain the expansive powers of life in order to secure it against the vulnerability and exposure that defines it. In a fearful nation, public sorrow was tamped down by the climate of uncertainty. If a father protested a son's death, it was feared another family member would be killed. If people you know disappeared, there was chance they might stay alive if you did not cause him trouble. This was scarring psychosis in the country. Death, loss was unfinished, so you could not walk through it. There had been years of night visitations, kidnappings, or murdering in broad daylight. Here we see the policing of trauma by the government officials. The trauma is being policed and nobody can do anything about it. The trauma is being suppressed down and people can do nothing. And there is also the disruption of the consciousness. Trauma is essentially the disruption in the consciousness. And there is also this biopolitical interconnection between trauma and life. Foucault defines governmentality as ensemble formed by institutions, procedures, analysis, and reflections, calculations, and tactics that allow the exercise of this very specific, albeit very complex power that has the population as its target. Biopolitics is of massifying nature. Foucault indicates the ways in which trauma figures in subjectivation. The pastoral genealogy that Foucault traces for modern power signals that biopolitics not only operates through the biological life of the population, but also through technologies of subjectivation, both individual and collective. So, there are at least 2 unauthorized places of detention in Colombo. Some of those picked up are there for a month, but the torture itself doesn't last long. Most can be broken within an hour. Most of us can be broken by just the possibility of what might happen. So this reminds us of Orwell's 1984, the torture scene of Winston. So people are tortured so that truth would come out or that they would readily confess, even things that they haven't done. So this kind of torture, this kind of gruesome torture is mentioned here. And we also see Lakma's trauma. Lakma is the niece of Palimbana, and Lakma's parents were killed during this insurrection. She lost her parents, and due to that shock, her verbal and motor ability were driven to infancy. And she became totally incapable of living a life of her own. She was later adopted by Palimbana. And there is another event of a traumatic description of a man taken on a bicycle to be murdered. Nobody can forget that incident. The people who witnessed the incident finds out that the event has been etched in their minds. It has been engraved in their minds. They can't forget it anymore. And this creation of fear inevitably leads to subjugation. people don't dare to lift their heads to respond, to protest. And trauma rooted in the process or trauma is inevitably rooted in the process of remembering. The recurring memory revalidates the trauma and repeats the negative experiences. Memory becomes a powerful aspect associated with traumatic subjectivity. So we find another quote: whatever the government is possibly doing now, it was worse when there was real chaos, terror everywhere from all sides. There were discoveries made during the worst political times, alongside 1,000 dirty little acts of race and politics, gang madness, and financial gain. War having come this far like a poison in the bloodstream could not get out. As said yesterday, we see the routinization of violence. Violence being violence being imposed on people, violence being becoming a routine, and it becomes a part of everyday life. The creation of chaos, which certainly leads to mental agitation and fear, is stressed in the novel. Instead of focusing on a peaceful method for bringing violence under control, violent subjugation is continuously adopted by the government to put down the insurrection. Trauma is essentially a sudden and punctual event that afflicts the subject from without. Agamben puts forward the figure of traumatized subjectivity to analyze the effects of trauma on the individual. And we see another quote: the night interrogations, the ones in daylight picking up citizens at random, mass disappearances at Surikanda, reports of mass graves at Agnimana, half the world it felt was being buried. The truth hidden by fear, while the past revealed itself. We see the truth being buried. There is a trope of burial throughout the novel. And Sharath had seen truth broken into suitable pieces and used by the foreign press alongside irrelevant photographs. We see the dismemberment of the truth of trauma. Truth becomes a simulated concept in an authoritarian world. And the country existed in a rocking, self-burying motion. And the truth is constantly distorted. Lie is often represented as the truth. The visual trauma is engraved in the minds of the onlookers, and they do not dare to question the government. The biopower, which is actually meant for sustaining life, takes a disastrous dimension in this instance. The power over individual bodies and massification is prominent here. What we find here is a tanto-political assault. There are burials and reburials to hide evidences. And we finally see the mapping of emotional trauma. There is a suicide attempt by Ananda, which can be linked to the disappearance of his wife. Due to the frustration he faces, he commits suicide. He tries to commit suicide. And also we see the effect on Lakma. Lakma, following the death of her parents, becomes a very reclusive person. And we also see the sacrifice of Sharath for truth. He eventually dies. He is not naive, as said before, but he dies for the sake of truth. That's all.
Thank you, Gifty, for a perceptive and close textual reading that brings forth the idea that came through in the keynote. Whose Sri Lanka are we talking about? Who is telling the story? And who is the reader who's receiving the story? I will open it up, and I don't know where, but we'll try and find a few minutes to talk about Anil's ghost, especially because so much is invested in this idea of the death of the author. And I think it has come through in the keynote, it has come through in all your presentations, including Professor Halpe's presentation, about the fact that Mr. Ondaatje does not wear his activism on his arm. That's probably why he is so misconstrued and misunderstood. And I still remember it was anathema walking into class when I was teaching that one full year course on Ondaatje's fiction. The year was 2008. And As I had mentioned yesterday in detail, the Sri Lankan conflict had spilled over into the diasporic classroom. And I had Sinhalese students, Marlene. I had Sri Lankan Tamil students who were ready to have a go at each other. It was a scary, scary moment for me. And that whole year, doesn't matter what we read, it came back to haunt us. And the least I could do is to highlight what Ondaatje's oeuvre always meant for those in the academy. And that also was broken apart when at the University of Toronto, there were academics who were saying, in Anil's Ghost, remember, Aparna, those conversations? Why is he being so soft on the Tamils? That's what the Sinhalese professor said. And the Tamil professor said, really? I don't think he's seen it from the Tamil side. So, you know, hello, what do we do? So instead of looking at the text, being the reader who is birthed after Ondaatje has handed it over to us, we were doing exactly the stereotypical thing of trying to dig out the truth. So what was the truth and whose truth was it? I think this is one novel that was probably the hardest and the most challenging to explicate or to get readers' response from, especially when the readers, some of them had been, as yesterday we heard from the keynote speaker, Rambakwela, they had been generationally conditioned to believe in one or the other. So the objectivity was completely lost. Okay, let's open up the floor for maybe 5 minutes for a quick conversation. Roma, I know you're dying to have a go at this. Will you start the conversation then?
Just want to start by saying all of the speakers were absolutely mind-blowing, and they brought, it was for me like a piece of lace, especially hearing Marlene, you know, with your trauma theory. I couldn't stop thinking of Coleridge's Christabel, if you remember, the whole Gothic episode of what you can talk about, and Coleridge's philosophical notion of the Gothic, that it is when it is not stated, it is not when it is not brought into particularities and specificities, that it contains a much greater philosophic and literary impact. But I just couldn't help thinking about that. But I want to say something very, very simplistic. I come to this not just as a literary scholar, but also as somebody who's worked in armed conflict with the United Nations all over the world. If you don't mind my being a bit provocative, but this whole notion of not taking sides and being objective, I don't know if we are in some ways participating in recolonization. Because from the perspective of, this is all post-Cartesian enlightenment, you know, the objective liberal, we rise above particularities. But from the vantage point of the people who are in the conflict, it isn't that simple, just to put that out. Number two, the thing that a lot of people forget about when we talk about armed conflict all over the world is the colonial narratives. Coming from biochemistry, race is the construct, doesn't exist in science, number one. Number two, all of these ethnicities and narratives are created with deep colonial roots. You have to understand the historical context of civil war. You can't start in the 20th century or the 19th century, okay? This is a whole different context. But just to keep it simple, I think we're dealing with literature here. He's not a historian. If you want to read records of what really happened, why read Ondaatje? You can go, you know, one has seen records of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and there is tons of records on the power of, you don't have closure. Your daughter's been raped and buried and burnt. There is no closure. So There are conversations that are initiated where the perpetrator at least comes and talks about the event. You're not getting the body back, but it helps the family to have some semblance of closure. Yeah, I just end with this one sentence because I always go back to Ondaatje. This is when Gamini stopped believing in man's rule on earth. He turned away from every person who stood up for war, whether the principle of one's land or the pride of ownership or even personal rights. All of those motives ended up somehow in the arms of careless power. So my question to everybody really is, while we come to it from the theory of care, whether we come to it from fascinating theories of post-Gothic detection, postmodern detection, Gothic trauma narratives, Foucault, somewhere in all these discourses is also what Ondaatje says, which is the arms of careless power. Sorry, I'll just stop there.
Isabel, Aparna, please go right ahead one by one.
Yeah, I think that it's really wise to separate the kind of context of sort of literature from writing history. I love the fact that no one has asked Alice Munro to weigh in on, you know, historical matters. I mean, I think that there's, you know, ways in which Ondaatje flirted with the history in profound ways. I mean, he named, as people have said at this conference, characters after historical figures. And there's a way in which he, you know, kind of blurred the boundaries constantly in writing memoirs and speaking as people did, that, you know, a well-told lie is worth 1,000 facts. You know, so he was always dancing on the edge of being kind of pulled into, you know, sort of you're writing history if you really want to be a fiction writer. But I mean, his whole thesis as a student was about how history becomes myth. And so I think that we missed the myth part. We overlook the myth. And Plato, I just think about how old these debates are. Plato wanted to kick, you know, fiction writers out of his republic because he said, if you want the truth, these guys are just liars. So I wholeheartedly agree, Roma, with the important separation of real lives, of, you know, kind of very careful kind of examinations of history for particular purposes. And what Ondaatje is doing, and I'm very simplistic in my view about what fiction offers. I really think it kind of casts up a screen of our fears and desires. And, you know, I like the philosopher Walter Benjamin. He always said, you know, never offer a kind of complacent resolution, a happy ending. He was pretty fierce. He said disappointment all the way, because he was really trying to goad readers into learning about these, the context which gave rise to the myths, and asking people to do their own homework and maybe getting it wrong inevitably, but never conflating fact and fiction, you know, even though it invites the conflation maddeningly. Anyway, thank you so much for your comment. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for your paper.
Thank you, Marlene. Aparna, just wanted to chip in there and say for a minute before you give us your response that the idea of fiction as history and history as fiction sort of slaps us in the face when you look at Roma's question by Hayden White. So, you know, how would you connect the dots, Aparna?
Well, I'd actually like to come back to what Marlene just said about Ondaatje's flirtation with myth. And if you think about Roland Barthes and myth as a second semiological system, and or even going through Bruce Lincoln back to the idea that the doublespeak of myth has a certain kind of not to step into your territory, but an affective power of persuasion that also arrives through myth. And I was always, I was struck when I read Anil's Ghost that I felt powerfully that he had told my story. And I couldn't put my finger on why, because of course, factually, it was all over the place, and there were clear departures from fact. I mean, it's so clearly artifice, and that goes to the myth of the text and the sort of the climate of chaos that he was trying to invoke through these very obvious silences, these slippages that were in the text. But I just wanted to, before I sign off, and I know I'm not so directly answering what you asked me, Julie, but there's something that occurs to me that might be interesting, especially in terms of what Lakshmi was pointing out in her paper. We talk about, I think, the sort of personification of language, the single arm of language. I think that is also a huge issue here. Ondaatje himself has talked about the loss of language, and with the loss of language comes also gaps in experience. And I do often wonder, coming back to the issue of the representation of the Tamil issue in Anil's post, whether that was in fact a signal of that he offered of the absence of language in that moment. So I just wanted to leave it there and take it away.
Yeah, point well noted, well taken. The last Sinhala word I lost was Batura, water in a kiss. I mean, how much more exacting can that issue of loss of language be? Isabel, you have the last word till we move, and then we move on and come back again for a total revamp. Go ahead.
Thank you, Julie. I have enjoyed extraordinarily the lectures and the papers, and I was most amazed by Marlene's paper, and I feel I need to respond on your call about care, and what can I say? Care, attention to it, which has been so neglected, and that's paying attention to care would be looking at one of those gaps, of history that we were talking about, and recovering those hidden histories that we want to recover, and care has been so, again, neglected. So what I think care can do, apart from somehow overturning the structures as we have them at present, even if it seems a very modest kind of approach, I think it is huge in its possibilities. But then care, apart from those lot of possibilities, I think it takes us away very nicely from the notion of truth, which has turned out to be so dangerous, and so to which we stick so hard, as Marlene has said. It's so gripping, the idea of truth, the idea of justice, and I think that incorporating care into the conversation can somehow disrupt these expectations, right? And that could be a way. And you opened the idea, which I haven't thought about, but I perhaps want to bring it back so that perhaps I don't know, but how do we care for history? You mentioned the wars, which is a novel I read years ago. I go back to that, and the whole matter of caring about history or caring for history. How do we do that? Also, and as you have said, unexpected things can happen at any point, and it cannot be buried in an unproblematic manner in any way. So really, for me, it is very haunting, this suggestion, and thank you for that, Marlene. I'll think more about that. And I think this is all I want to say at this point. There are so many, interesting things.
I'm really looking forward to the next 3 papers by our graduate first-class students on the English patient. And I hope you'll stay for them. And then Cynthia Vanden Ryssen will come in and give her overall view, and anyone else who wants. Thank you, Roma, for that excellent explication. Aparna, Marlene, and Isabel.